Hello, my name is Steve Kaufman, and this is the third part of the fifth video in a series of videos that I'm doing that tells the same story I already told in this book, and so on and so forth. And because this is the third part of what was supposed to be a single video that has now become a four-part video, once again, I'm just going to jump right into it. But you were thinking about it, but you'll eat anything. What if it's written down or on a screen? In any case, in this particular video, I'm going to describe how our individual flows of awareness use our individual minds to produce the internally projected appearance that we are aware of and refer to as mental reality. And so what I'm going to describe in this video is how the same basic mind structure that an individual and animating awareness uses to produce externally projected physical appearances when its mind is impactively penetrated by certain relational structures that exist external to that mind is also used by that individual and animating awareness to produce internally reflected mental appearances, both as an indirect result of externally arising impactive penetrations and, in more highly evolved minds, even in the absence of any externally arising impactive penetrations. But before I do that, I want to very briefly point out that in the previous video, I was able to explain how we use our minds to create physical reality without having to introduce anything really new to this model of reality. Instead, all I did was explain how the same fundamental reality that we have been discussing in all of these videos, i.e., formless awareness, is able to form a new set of relations with itself once it has structurally evolved to the point where it is able to function as the specialized fourth level relational structure that we refer to as a mind. And what I am in the process of explaining is that that new set of relations doesn't result in the emergence of a new level of relational structure, but instead results in the creation of an entirely new set of realities that are nothing more than appearances that are completely different in nature than the fundamental, singular, relationally structured, and yet ultimately formless reality that is actually there, both creating and becoming aware of those appearances. And now, that having been said, there are two questions that we need to ask and answer with regard to the mind's creation of mental reality. One, how is the mind used by an individual awareness to create what it becomes aware of as mental reality? And two, what functional purpose does the creation of mental reality serve in terms of helping fourth level relational structures to continue to survive and function as fourth level structures, which is to say, as structures that can continue to be animated by the flow of awareness through them? We'll begin by answering the question regarding how an individual awareness is able to use the mind it is flowing through and animating to create what it becomes aware of as its mental reality. As explained in the previous video, in order for an individual awareness to use its mind to create a physical reality, an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary needs to arise in its mind. And as I will now explain, in order for an individual awareness to use its mind to create a mental reality, an oppositely oriented, outwardly penetrating impactive boundary needs to arise in its mind. And the reason an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary needs to arise in the mind in order for an individual awareness to use its mind to produce a mental reality is because such outwardly penetrating impactive boundaries function as concave lenses that internally and partially reflect the light of awareness back to a point that lies within the mind, thereby producing within the mind an internally appearing awareness shadow that the animating and illuminating awareness then becomes aware of, and which internally appearing awareness shadows we refer to as mental realities. That is, just as the light of awareness is modified as it passes through an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary so that it ends up projecting and producing an externally appearing awareness shadow or physical appearance, the light of awareness is similarly modified as it is reflected back to a point that lies within the mind so that it ends up reflecting and producing an internally appearing awareness shadow or mental appearance. Now, the original and most primitive of minds were not and are not able to produce the mental realities that we refer to as concepts. Instead, the original and most primitive of minds were and are only able to produce individual mental realities that have a one to one correspondence with individual physical realities. And later, I will get into how more structurally evolved minds produce the compound mental realities that we refer to as concepts. but to get to the point where you can understand what a concept actually is and how those more complex mental realities are produced by more structurally evolved minds, you first need to understand how primitive minds produce individual mental appearances or realities that have a one to one correspondence with individual physical appearances or realities. And primitive minds are able to be used by their individual and animating awarenesses to produce individual mental appearances or realities that have a one to one correspondence with some physical appearance or reality, because the only way for an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary to arise in a primitive mind is as an indirect result of that mind's involvement in an impactive relation with an external reality that directly causes an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary to arise in that mind. Specifically, and as described in the last video, when an externally existent relational structure penetratively impacts a mind, that event causes an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary to arise in that mind, and that inwardly penetrating impactive boundary is then used by that mind's animating and illuminating awareness to project an externally appearing appearance or physical reality. But here's the new thing: the same impactive event that directly produces an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary in a mind also, through the force of action and reaction, indirectly produces an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary in that same mind. And that outwardly penetrating impactive boundary is then used by that mind's animating awareness to internally reflect an internally appearing appearance or mental reality that corresponds to and is basically an internal reproduction of the physical reality that was externally projected and produced using the corresponding inwardly penetrating impactive boundary. Now, that's a lot to take in, and as usual, it's much simpler than it sounds. So let's break down what I just said using a series of drawings so that you can see exactly how primitive minds are able to produce physical and mental realities that have a one to one correspondence as a result of those minds being penetratively impacted by relational structures that exist external to them. As already stated, for a primitive mind, and for our minds as well, the process of physical and mental experiential creation begins when a relational structure that exists external to a mind penetratively impacts that mind, thereby causing an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary to arise in that mind that that mind's individual and animating awareness then uses to project and produce an externally appearing reality that it becomes aware of as a specific physical experience, such as the physical experience of either hot or cold, depending on the structural orientation of the impactive relation. Now, here's the new concept and the additional thing that makes it possible for minds to be used to produce internally arising appearances or mental realities that correspond to the externally arising appearances or physical realities that they are also being used to create. The force of impact that directly produces an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary and so a specific physical appearance is, through the force of action and reaction, mechanically transferred to the opposite side of the mind, where it there indirectly produces an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary that is then used by that mind's animating and illuminating awareness to produce an internally reflected specific mental appearance that corresponds to the specific physical appearance, and so is essentially an internal or mental reproduction of the external or physical appearance. And so, what I'm saying is that if a mind is penetratively impacted by an externally existent relational structure, so that an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary arises in that mind that is then used to produce the physical experience of hotness as a specific external appearance, the force of that same impactive penetration also indirectly produces in that same mind an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary that is then used to internally produce or reproduce the mental experience of hotness as a specific internal appearance. And that is how primitive minds are able to produce specific mental realities that have a one to one correspondence with specific physical realities. Basically, the impactive penetration of a mind by an external reality is the cause, and that single cause produces two effects in that mind: a direct effect and an indirect effect. The direct effect is the arising of an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary, and the indirect effect is the arising of an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary. And the former is used by that mind's animating awareness to produce a specific physical appearance, and the latter is used by that mind's animating awareness to produce a specific mental appearance that corresponds to the specific physical appearance. That, in a nutshell, is how minds function to produce individual mental realities that correspond to and are basically internal reproductions of externally appearing physical realities. And now that I've explained how minds are used to produce individual physical and mental realities that have a one-to-one correspondence, let's now look at what purpose mental reality serves. As stated previously, physical reality, owing to how it is created, functions to provide animating and illuminating awarenesses with relative information regarding certain aspects of the relationally structured environment that exists external to their minds. However, that relative physical information by itself is of no functional use unless an individual awareness has a way of responding to external reality on the basis of that physical information. And that is where mental reality comes in, because mental reality is an internal representation of the mind's response to external reality. And mental reality exists as an internal representation of the mind's response to external reality because the outwardly penetrating impactive boundary that is used to produce mental reality is the mind's structural reaction or response to external reality, because that structural reaction or response has as its cause, at least in primitive minds, the externally existent reality or stimulus that penetratively impacted the mind and, in so doing, indirectly gave rise to the outwardly penetrating impactive boundary as a response to that stimulus. Action reaction, stimulus response. Just two different ways of stating the same chain of events. And so, what I've just described is the basic and fundamental stimulus response mechanism by which primitive minds operate, and by which all minds still operate, with the stimulus being the external reality that impactively penetrates the mind, thereby making possible the mind's production of an externally appearing physical reality, and with the response being the indirect arising of an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary in the mind that both penetrates into external reality and also makes possible the mind's production of an internally appearing mental reality. And because what an individual awareness becomes aware of as its mental reality is an internal representation of its mind's responses to external reality, mental reality is, owing to its method of creation, inextricably linked and so tethered to how fourth level structures respond to external reality, in the same way that physical reality is tethered to external reality owing to its method of creation. And that tethering of mental reality to an organism's response to external reality is why you can be under no physically perceived threat whatsoever, but still have your body respond as if you were actually being externally threatened by producing all sorts of fight or flight hormones when you are aware of a threatening mental reality. And that's because mental reality and the mind's response to external reality are two aspects of the same event. And that same event is the arising of an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary in the mind. And as human beings, we are able to produce responses as a result of purely mental threats because our minds have evolved the ability to produce outwardly penetrating impactive boundaries in the absence of any corresponding external stimulus. And the ability of our minds to produce outwardly penetrating impactive boundaries and so responses to external reality in the absence of any corresponding external stimulus evolved for a reason and can be a very useful ability. But that ability did not exist in what I refer to as the original or Series 1 minds, because for a Series 1 mind to produce a response, there has to be a corresponding external stimulus that indirectly produces that response. And that response is automatic and so is always a reaction, meaning it takes place without any input from the animating awareness. Action reaction, stimulus response. Inwardly penetrating impactive boundary, outwardly penetrating impactive boundary. Externally appearing physical reality, internally appearing mental reality. Those are four different ways of describing what happens when a Series 1 mind is basically run into or penetratively impacted by a relational structure that exists external to it. And so, for an individual awareness that is flowing through and animating a Series 1 mind, physical and mental reality both just arise and appear without any input from that animating awareness, other than its illuminating function. So, with that structural and evolutionary level of mind, the animating and illuminating awareness is like someone in a theater watching a movie that just becomes aware of the projected and reflected appearances as they arise without having the ability to alter or determine which appearances arise. And so, for an individual awareness that is animating and illuminating a Series 1 mind, physical and mental reality exist more as entertainment than as useful information. And when fourth level structures first began to move out of their womb like environment, the mind's automatic one to one responses to external reality or external stimuli were apparently enough to allow those primitive fourth level structures to survive in those more challenging environments. But eventually, fourth level structures began to move into even more challenging environments where those automatic one to one action reaction responses were no longer enough to allow those structures to survive long enough to reproduce in those more challenging environments. And as a result, Series 1 mind evolved into Series 2 mind so that fourth level structures could structurally survive in those more challenging environments. Now, the main difference between a Series 1 mind and a Series 2 mind is that a Series 2 mind is able to produce an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary, and so a specific response to external reality, and so a specific mental reality in the absence of the specific external stimulus, and so specific physical reality that a Series 1 mind would need in order to produce that specific response to external reality. Basically, a Series 2 mind is able to form associations between responses that tend to arise in sequence or simultaneously as a result of encountering stimuli that tend to impact it in sequence or simultaneously, so that once that association between responses has been made, only a single stimulus is needed to produce a compound, more complex, and more functional response to external reality. And again, that's a lot to take in, but it's really very simple. And so let's break it down by comparing how Series 1 and 2 minds each respond to simultaneous or sequential stimuli. Here's a Series 1 mind being simultaneously or sequentially impacted by two different relational structures that we will refer to as stimulus A and stimulus B. Now, stimulus A and stimulus B each directly produce an inwardly penetrating impactive boundary and a specific physical experience, and each stimulus also indirectly produces an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary, which we will refer to as response A and response B. And each of those responses allows for the production of a specific mental experience that is basically an internal reproduction of its corresponding physical experience. And no matter how many times those two stimuli simultaneously or sequentially impact a Series 1 mind, that Series 1 mind can only produce each outwardly penetrating response in mental reality as a response to its corresponding stimulus, meaning response A can only ever occur as an indirect result of stimulus A, and response B can only ever occur as an indirect result of stimulus B. That's how original or Series 1 minds operate. And with that in mind, next let's look at how a Series 2 mind is able to eventually respond to that same situation after it has been repeatedly impacted, either simultaneously or in sequence, by two stimuli. When a Series 2 mind first encounters two stimuli, either simultaneously or in sequence, it is only able to respond in the same way a Series 1 mind is able to respond, which is by producing a specific response as a result of a specific stimulus. But once a Series 2 mind has repeatedly encountered the same two stimuli simultaneously or in sequence, a Series 2 mind is able to do something that a Series 1 mind cannot do. And what a Series 2 mind is able to do that a Series 1 mind cannot do is form a structural connection and so an association between the two areas in its mind where outwardly penetrating impactive boundaries repeatedly arose, either simultaneously or in sequence, so that when either of those areas is again caused to penetrate outwardly as a response to its corresponding stimulus, the other area is caused to penetrate outwardly as well, in the absence of its corresponding stimulus. Basically, the structural connection that is formed between the two areas of the mind where outwardly penetrating impactive boundaries repeatedly arose, either simultaneously or in sequence, makes it possible for a single externally arising force of impact or stimulus to be mechanically transferred to two different areas on the opposite side of the mind instead of just one, so that that single force of impact or stimulus then causes two outwardly penetrating impactive boundaries to arise in the mind as a compound response to what is only a single stimulus. Specifically, when a Series 2 mind is repeatedly impacted by stimulus A and B simultaneously or in sequence, response areas A and B form a structural connection and association so that both response areas are then able to be caused to penetrate outwardly as a response to just one of those two stimuli, meaning that either stimulus A or B alone is able to produce both response A and B. Put another way, the force of impact from either stimulus A or B is able to indirectly cause both response areas A and B to penetrate outwardly as a response to what is just a single stimulus, owing to the structural connection that was previously established in that Series 2 mind between response areas A and B as a result of those two response areas being repeatedly activated either simultaneously or in sequence. And in terms of what an individual awareness that is animating and illuminating a Series 2 mind becomes aware of as physical and mental reality, what that structural association between response areas means is that there is no longer just a one-to-one correspondence between a specific physical reality and a specific mental reality, because there is now a one-to-two correspondence between a specific physical reality and two specific mental realities. That is, physical reality A now corresponds not just to mental reality A, but also to mental reality B. And physical reality B now corresponds not just to mental reality B, but also to mental reality A. And what that means is that when only stimulus A or B occurs, the animating awareness only becomes aware of either physical reality A or B, but becomes aware of both mental reality A and B. And that may not seem like a big deal, but it is a very big deal because it is that type of simple association between mental realities that causes a dog to salivate when it hears a bell, if it has been conditioned by having been previously stimulated on numerous occasions by the sound of a bell and the simultaneous presentation of food. Because if a dog has been conditioned in that way, when it is subsequently stimulated by just the bell, the individual awareness that is flowing through and animating the body of the dog only becomes physically aware of the sound of the bell, but becomes mentally aware of both the sound of the bell and the image and odor of food, because those different mental realities have now been structurally connected and associated, and so now exist as a compound mental reality or concept in the mind of that dog. And because any mind's response to external reality is not a direct function of what that mind is being used to create as physical reality, but is instead a direct function of what that mind is being used to create as mental reality, the dog's mind responds to just the bell stimulus as if the food stimulus was also actually present by causing salivation to occur. And so, even though the dog's animating awareness is not aware of the physical experience of food, it is aware of the mental experience of food as a response to the now associated bell stimulus. And the ability of a Series 2 mind to automatically form that sort of simple association between two or more otherwise unrelated mental realities as a result of its being simultaneously or sequentially stimulated is important to understand. Because at the present time, increasing numbers of human beings are voluntarily and yet unknowingly having their minds conditioned by misinformation and propaganda that creates an association between otherwise unrelated mental realities as a result of having their minds repeatedly stimulated by hearing the same lies over and over, so that they then, like a dog, become conditioned to respond not according to any actually existent external reality, but according to whatever set of now falsely associated mental realities their mind has been conditioned to produce when stimulated by a particular external reality. For example, here in the States, and no doubt elsewhere, propaganda is used to create an association between immigrants of a certain skin tone and crime. And that association is created by repeatedly putting out physical misinformation that causes the image of immigrants of a certain skin tone and crime to repeatedly and simultaneously arise in the mind as mental realities. So that then, once that mental association has been created, only immigrants of that skin tone need be mentioned in order for the mental image of crime to arise in a mind that has been so conditioned, because that mind has automatically constructed and so now possesses a compound mental reality or concept that is composed of those two mental realities. And because how a mind responds to reality is a direct function of its mentally created reality and not its physically created reality, when a mind that has been conditioned in that way encounters that particular immigrant stimulus, that mind has no choice but to respond by producing both the mental image of that immigrant and the mental image of crime, resulting in that mind automatically responding to that immigrant as if that immigrant were actually a criminal. Because again, the mind's response is not a direct function of physically perceived reality, but is a direct function of its mentally conceived reality. And that really is the whole point of propaganda and misinformation, i.e., to create a response not according to what is externally perceived, but according to what the willing and yet unwitting victim of that propaganda has been conditioned to mentally conceive and so believe, because that conditioned response in some way benefits the propagandist. And so, just as a dog's mind can be conditioned to respond to food that is not actually externally there, people are allowing their minds to be conditioned by misinformation and propaganda that causes them to respond to realities that aren't actually externally there, but which only exist in their mind as a concept. because it benefits the people who are spreading the propaganda and misinformation to have people literally trained like dogs to respond in a dysfunctional, counterproductive, and non self serving or self sabotaging way to the various dog whistles or stimuli that those same propagandists then use to elicit the programmed and conditioned responses. It's a sad and tragic situation, but it's where we are and it's where we will remain until more people begin to pay more attention to and become more discerning about the information they use to construct their conceptual realities or beliefs. Because it is those conceptual realities or beliefs and not physically perceived reality that determines how we respond to physically perceived reality. Because, as I am in the process of explaining, that's how our minds are designed to work. And our minds are designed to work that way for a reason, because the ability to form concepts or compound mental realities and so compound responses to external reality without having to have every corresponding external stimulus take place is a useful ability, provided that the concepts and so compound responses reflect an actually existent external situation or reality and are not constructed on the basis of informational bullshit. For example, it is a conditioned association between mental realities that keeps you from sticking your hand in a fire a second time after having been burned by it just once, unless you're an idiot. I rest my case. And now let's take a more detailed look at how this type of mental association plays out for an individual awareness that is animating a Series 2 mind, so that we can see how this evolutionary improvement of the mind is able to work to an organism's advantage when that ability is not being misused and abused by propagandists and other bad faith actors. Stimulus A occurs, but this time around, stimulus B does not occur. And as an indirect result of stimulus A impacting the mind, a corresponding outwardly penetrating impactive boundary arises in response area A. But because of the now established structural connection and association between response areas A and B, even though stimulus B has not occurred, an outwardly penetrating impactive boundary also arises in area B, so that the individual awareness that is animating that mind becomes aware of both mental realities A and B, but only physical reality A. And now, instead of just experiential entertainment, the individual awareness now has useful mental information that gives deeper meaning to physical reality A, because it now has additional mental information about physical reality A that did not originally derive from stimulus A, but originally derived from stimulus B. And again, that may not seem like a big deal, but I cannot overstate the importance of this new ability of a Series 2 mind to form associations between different response areas so that specific mental realities that correspond to specific physical realities can be created in the absence of the specific external stimulus needed to create their corresponding physical reality. Because what this new ability means is that even when only stimulus A occurs and creates only physical reality A, the individual awareness now has mental information about physical reality A that includes an internal or mental reproduction of physical reality B. And what that means is that the individual awareness that is animating and illuminating that mind now has relative information about external reality that is not being directly provided by physical reality, but is instead being indirectly provided by mental reality. And that indirect and mentally provided information, or mental reality B, tells the animating awareness something about external reality that physical reality alone cannot, in that moment, tell it, because only stimulus A is happening, and so only physical reality A is being produced. And what that mental information tells the animating awareness is that even though it is only aware of physical reality A, physical reality B is there as well. And that additional mental information is equivalent to a Series 2 mind responding not according to what its animating and illuminating awareness physically perceives, but according to what it mentally conceives as a result of what it physically perceives. Because mental reality A and B each correspond to an area of outward penetration in the mind. And those outward penetrations are that mind's compound response to what is, in this example, a single stimulus. And so all a concept is two or more mental realities that have been connected through structural association so that the animating and illuminating awareness always becomes aware of those mental realities as a single compound mental unit, and which single compound mental units we refer to as concepts. And that's why I've said in previous videos that our minds form concepts by playing what is essentially a game of connect the dots with individual mental realities. For example, the statement fire is hot is the physical expression of what is ultimately a concept or compound mental reality. And that particular concept has been constructed by connecting the mental reality of fire to the mental reality of hotness. The point that I'm making here is that, contrary to what most people believe, we don't respond to external reality according to what we physically perceive. Physical perception is just the beginning or starting point for our responses. What really determines how we respond to physically perceived reality are all the structurally connected and so structurally associated mental realities that are activated and arise in our minds as a result of what we perceive as physical reality. Put another way, what ultimately determines how we respond to physically perceived reality is what we conceive as a result of what we physically perceive, because conceptions are mental realities and mental realities are internally arising appearances that can only be created as the result of outwardly penetrating impactive boundaries that arise in our minds. And those outwardly penetrating impactive boundaries are our mind's response to external reality. And just as an individual awareness that is animating and illuminating a Series 1 mind does not have any real control over its responses to external reality, because those responses are automatic and reflexive and take place according to the specific stimulus that indirectly gives rise to the response, it is also the case that an individual awareness that is animating and illuminating a Series 2 mind also does not have any real control over its responses to external reality, because those responses are still automatic and reflexive and also take place according to the specific stimulus that indirectly gives rise to either the single or compound response. That is, an individual awareness that is animating and illuminating a Series 2 mind does not get to choose which individual mental realities it is going to structurally connect or associate in order to produce a compound mental reality or concept. Instead, in a Series 2 mind, those structural connections and associations are made automatically according to how the mind is stimulated. Put another way, a Series 2 mind cannot form a connection between mental realities and so cannot produce a concept in the absence of those mental realities either simultaneously or sequentially arising in that mind. Because for a Series 2 mind to form a structural connection between the areas of its mind that produce two mental realities, those two areas of its mind first have to be caused to penetrate outwardly, either simultaneously or sequentially, by the individual external stimulus that indirectly corresponds to each mental reality. What that means, in practical terms, is that a Series 2 mind can't produce the concept fire is cold, but can only produce the concept fire is hot, because the two mental realities of fire and hot are the ones that are able to be simultaneously created as a result of being impactively penetrated by the relational structure that is actually there where the physical reality of fire appears to be. But even though the external responses of a Series 2 mind are still automatic and not yet guided by the animating and illuminating awareness, being able to respond in that compound way provides fourth level structures that have Series 2 minds with a significant evolutionary advantage, because those fourth level structures don't have to wait for a beneficial or damaging stimulus to occur in order to respond accordingly. Instead, Series 2 minds can respond preemptively on the basis of the associated stimulus. For example, a fourth level structure that has a Series 2 mind doesn't have to directly physically experience the heat from a fire in order to respond to that particular stimulus, once the connection has been made between the mental realities of fire and heat. And so once the concept fire is hot is able to be created by that mind as a compound mental reality. Now here I need to point out that Series 2 minds do not conceptualize using language. Instead, Series 2 minds conceptualize using the internal mental reproductions of their corresponding physical appearances. And so when I say that a Series 2 mind is able to form the concept fire is hot, I do not mean to imply that Series 2 minds conceptualize like we do, using language. It's just that I have to use language to transfer these concepts to your Series 4 mind. And so I have to use words to indicate what is, to a Series 2 mind, just an internal mental reproduction of the corresponding physical appearance. In general, the evolution of the mind proceeds along two tracks. One of those tracks involves sensory upgrades that make it possible for more highly evolved minds to produce increasingly detailed physical etchings of the relationally structured reality that is actually externally there, where those increasingly detailed physical etchings appear to be. And the other of those two evolutionary tracks involves the mind increasing and so upgrading its ability to form structural connections between mental realities so that it can respond in a more complex and functional way to physically perceived reality. And just as sensory upgrades make it possible for more highly evolved minds to produce increasingly detailed physical etchings of the relationally structured reality that's actually externally there, the mind's mental upgrades that increase its ability to form structural connections between mental realities make it possible for more highly evolved minds to produce increasingly detailed mental maps or mental interpretations of physically perceived reality, as more and more structural connections and associations are formed between different mental realities that correspond to particular physical realities. And with regard to those two evolutionary tracks, I am focusing on the one that involves the mind increasing and so upgrading its ability to produce increasingly complex and compound mental appearances or concepts, because it is those increasingly complex mental appearances or concepts that have caused our individual awarenesses to become effectively trapped in mind generated physical and mental experiential environments that are, relative to our animating and illuminating awareness, no more real than reflections, rainbows, or shadows. Because physical reality alone cannot obscure from your awareness the reality that is actually there. And so physical reality alone cannot obscure from your awareness your own reality in nature. Instead, physical reality can only function as a delusion that obscures from an individual awareness the reality that is actually there once the mind evolves to the point where it is able to produce the compound mental realities or concepts that we refer to as beliefs, and specifically, once it evolves to the point where it is able to produce false beliefs, i.e., concepts that have no correspondence to any actually existent situation, circumstance, or reality. And so let's continue with this discussion of how the mind gradually improves its ability to form mental connections in order to establish the conceptual context that will make it possible for you to understand exactly what false beliefs are and how such mistaken and erroneously constructed concepts function to convert what are only mind generated physical and mental appearances into self obscuring and awareness entrapping delusions. Now, the type of mental connections and conceptual creations that Series 2 minds are able to automatically form qualifies as the mental activity that we call learning, but does not qualify as the mental activity that we call thinking. Put another way, Series 2 minds can learn from externally derived physical experience, but they cannot think. And that's because the mental activity that we refer to as thinking is a special form of learning that requires a Series 3 mind or higher. Put another way, the mental activity that we refer to as thinking can result in learning, but learning does not necessarily involve thinking. In a Series 3 mind, both learning and thinking involve the formation of structural connections and so associations between individual mental realities that correspond to individual physical realities. And so both learning and thinking involve the creation of compound mental realities or concepts. However, in a Series 2 mind, conceptual creation, as already stated, is automatic and involuntary, since structural connections between mental realities are established according to how that mind is stimulated. That is learning in the absence of thinking. On the other hand, what a Series 3 mind is able to do is learn through the process of thinking. So what I'm going to do now is describe exactly what the process of thinking is with respect to Series 3 minds by explaining how learning produced by thinking differs from learning that does not involve thinking. What thinking is, with respect to a Series 3 mind, is the ability of an individual awareness to consciously and so voluntarily choose to associate two or more mental realities that correspond to two or more physical realities, in the absence of those mental realities ever having been caused to arise simultaneously or sequentially as a result of simultaneously or sequentially occurring external stimuli. Put another way, the only way a Series 2 mind can learn or structurally associate two or more mental realities and thereby produce a concept is automatically, as a result of the repeated occurrence of two or more simultaneously or sequentially arising external stimuli. And both Series 3 and Series 4 minds can learn in that automatic way as well, which is why dogs can be conditioned or programmed to salivate at the sound of a bell, and why human beings can be conditioned or programmed by propaganda and misinformation. Because when a mind undergoes a functional upgrade, it does not lose its previous abilities. Instead, the new ability arises as the result of an addition to the mind structure that is built on top of or as an extension of the already existent mind structure. And so, even though a dog possesses a Series 3 mind and you are animating and illuminating a Series 4 mind, those Series 3 and 4 minds can still be automatically programmed and conditioned like a Series 2 mind, because the Series 1 and 2 mind is still there, functioning as the foundation upon which any Series 3 or 4 mind is constructed. However, what Series 3 minds can do that Series 2 minds cannot do in terms of learning or conceptual creation is allow their animating and illuminating awarenesses to consciously and so voluntarily choose to structurally associate two or more mental realities that correspond to two or more physical realities, in the absence of those mental realities ever having been caused to arise simultaneously or sequentially as a result of simultaneously or sequentially occurring external stimuli. And that conscious and so voluntarily choice to structurally associate two or more mental realities that correspond to two or more physical realities, in the absence of those mental realities ever having been caused to arise simultaneously or sequentially as a result of simultaneously or sequentially occurring external stimuli, is the type of learning or conceptual creation that we refer to as thinking. Ultimately, all learning is the result of conceptual creation, and conceptual creation is always the result of structural connections that have been established between specific areas of the mind that correspond to particular mental realities, so that those areas of the mind can thereafter be simultaneously activated and caused to outwardly penetrate simultaneously, thereby allowing for the creation of compound mental realities that are apprehended by the animating awareness as the individual mental units that we refer to as concepts. And again, in a Series 2 mind, those structural connections are made automatically without any input from the animating awareness as a result of simultaneously or sequentially occurring stimuli. And so in a Series 2 mind, the connect the dots process of conceptual creation or learning is automatic and so does not qualify as thinking. On the other hand, what Series 3 minds can do that Series 2 minds cannot do is form structural connections between areas of its mind that correspond to two or more mental realities as a result of its animating awareness consciously choosing to draw or make a connection between those individual mental dots, with the result being the voluntary creation of an entirely new concept, and so an entirely new response to external reality that is not the result of automatic learning, but is the result of conscious learning or thinking. And so now let's look at what this thinking upgrade of the mind means in practical terms. And in practical terms, what the thinking upgrade of the mind means is that organisms or fourth level structures that possess Series 3 minds are able to respond to external reality by consciously choosing to arrange various elements of what their animating awarenesses perceive as physical reality. And individual awarenesses that are animating Series 3 minds are able to consciously choose to arrange various elements of what they are aware of as physical reality by first consciously choosing to internally draw a connection between and thereby structurally link the individual mental dots or realities that correspond to those various physical elements, which then produces an external response that brings those physical elements together in the way they were first mentally conceived or imagined to be together. And what all that means in practical terms is that it is that sort of conscious learning or thinking that allows animals to build nests and that allowed early humans to begin making primitive tools. Because building nests and making primitive tools are responses to external reality that involve an organism bringing otherwise unrelated physical elements together as the result of a purely imagined connection between otherwise unrelated mental realities that first had to be consciously thought into place by that mind's animating awareness through the process of thinking. Now, obviously, nest building is partly instinctual, but what we refer to as an instinct is just an external response that has as its basis a concept or structural connection in the mind that has been passed on genetically, so that subsequent generations have that particular response pre wired into their minds. But initially, concepts and so structural connections that are now instinctual first had to be thought into place by an animating awareness. Now, exactly how a structural connection in an individual mind that produces a new and novel response to external reality ends up being encoded in that organism's DNA so that it can then be passed on to subsequent generations as an instinctual response, I have no idea at present, other than to say genetic mutations are not random but happen by design. Nothing is really random. Randomness is just an appearance, because beneath the appearance of physical randomness, there is only awareness moving in relation to itself and forming relations with itself through the exercise of different scales of individual conscious intention. For example, the individual and localized flow of awareness through a body results from the exercise of one scale of conscious intention. And as an individual awareness flows through and animates a body, that localized awareness is able to exercise a smaller scale of conscious intention within the larger scale of conscious intention that gave rise to it. And at this smaller scale, that conscious intention can be conscious or unconscious, i.e., operating with some awareness of what it is and what it is doing, or operating in complete unawareness of what it is and what it is doing. But either way, the operation of conscious intention is not random, but is being chosen by the awareness that is actually there based on what it is aware of as reality, which includes what it is aware of as itself. As explained earlier, how we either consciously or unconsciously choose to direct our smaller scale of conscious intention places our localized conscious intention in a relation of either self alignment or self opposition with respect to our larger non localized scale of conscious intention, thereby producing what we become aware of as either a positive or negative emotion. Ultimately, nothing is really random because there is nothing physical, mental, or emotional actually happening. All that is actually happening are movements and relations of awareness to itself that first result in awareness becoming relationally and progressively structured, after which other relations of awareness to itself take place that result in the production of physical, mental, and emotional appearances within awareness that are then apprehended by individual awarenesses as realities, and, in the case of most individual human awarenesses, mistakenly believed to be realities that are actually there. And I've already described the relations of awareness to itself that produce the appearances that we are aware of and refer to as physical and emotional reality. And I am now describing the relations of awareness to itself that produce the appearance that we are aware of and refer to as mental reality. And specifically, before I went off on that tangent, I was in the middle of describing what distinguishes a Series 3 mind from a Series 2 mind. And what distinguishes a Series 3 mind from a Series 2 mind is the addition of conscious learning through the process of thinking, as opposed to automatic learning that does not involve thinking. As already stated, all learning involves the mind forming structural connections between mental realities so that those mental realities then appear as the single and yet compound mental unit that we refer to as a concept, because forming connections between mental realities and producing concepts is how the mind is able to produce complex or compound responses to external reality. And in a Series 2 mind, the formation of those structural connections is determined by the pattern of external stimulation. And so in a Series 2 mind, learning is automatic or involuntary because it does not involve the input of the animating awareness. On the other hand, in a Series 3 mind, the formation of some of those structural connections is able to be determined not by the pattern of external stimulation, but by the animating awareness consciously choosing to form connections between certain mental realities that correspond to certain physical realities. And so in a Series 3 mind, learning or conceptual creation can also be voluntary when it requires and so involves the conscious input of the animating awareness. And so the conscious or voluntary learning that Series 3 minds are capable of is the type of learning that results from the process that we refer to as thinking, because what we refer to as thinking involves a mind's animating awareness consciously choosing to link or draw connections between certain mental realities. And the type of thinking that a Series 3 mind can perform can be referred to as Level 1 thinking. More specifically, Level 1 thinking refers to an animating awareness's ability to use its mind to consciously connect specific mental realities that correspond to specific physical realities, without those mental realities first having to be simultaneously or sequentially caused to arise in that mind as a result of the simultaneous or sequential occurrence of their corresponding external stimuli. And then eventually, in human beings, the Series 3 mind was upgraded to a Series 4 mind, as Level 1 thinking was upgraded to Level 2 thinking. And what a Series 4 mind is able to do that a Series 3 mind cannot do, that qualifies as Level 2 thinking, is allow its animating awareness to construct compound mental realities or concepts by consciously forming connections between mental realities that are themselves conceptual in nature. And what that means, in the simplest terms possible, is that what level 2 thinking involves is consciously creating concepts by playing connect the dots with previously created concepts, thereby allowing for the creation of increasingly complex and abstract concepts that may or may not correspond to any actually existent external situation, circumstance, or reality. For example, the same upgrade of the mind that made it possible for Einstein to come up with his relativity theories, which, for reasons that I explained in video 3 of this series, do correspond to relationally structured external reality, has also made it possible for people to come up with increasingly unhinged conspiracy theories, because those theories all require level 2 thinking, i.e., thinking that involves using concepts to create progressively higher order concepts. What that means is that the level 2 thinking function of the Series 4 mind can be used to produce concepts that are increasingly accurate, resulting in increasingly functional responses to external reality, or it can be used to produce concepts that are increasingly inaccurate, resulting in increasingly dysfunctional responses to external reality. And it is the level 2 thinking upgrade of the mind that is the primary and perhaps only thing that distinguishes humans from animals, because it is that upgrade in thinking that allowed humans to develop complex verbal and eventually written language as a way of transferring concepts that were thought up by one mind to other minds without those other minds having to themselves think up that concept, provided that those other minds speak the same language and that they also possess a conceptual context that is compatible with the concept that is being transmitted and transferred using language. Think of it this way: the palette that an individual awareness that is animating a Series 3 mind has to work with as it thinks or consciously constructs concepts is limited to individual mental realities that correspond to individual physical realities, and individual physical realities to be created require a specific external stimulus. On the other hand, the palette that an individual awareness that is animating a Series 4 mind has to work with, as it thinks or consciously constructs concepts, is potentially unlimited, because an individual awareness that is animating a Series 4 mind can use concepts that it has itself constructed or that someone else has constructed and then transfer it to its mind using verbal or written language as the mental dots or building blocks in its conscious construction of higher order, more complex, and more abstract concepts. And then those higher order concepts can themselves be used as mental dots or building blocks in the conscious creation of an even higher order concept. And on and on and on it can go with no end to that process. Because no matter how abstract a concept is, that concept, once it has been created, can then be used in the construction of a higher order and even more abstract concept. Therefore, the process of abstract thinking or abstract conceptualization that human beings are able to engage in using their Series 4 minds is an iterative and so progressive process. And that iterative process of abstract thinking or abstract conceptualization is reflected in written language, inasmuch as written language is clearly constructed through a process of iterative and so progressive conceptual compoundment or connection. Specifically, written language begins by having an alphabet or set of symbols that each represent a very basic concept. And then those symbols are grouped into words to form higher order concepts, and then words are grouped into sentences, and sentences into paragraphs, and paragraphs into chapters, and chapters into books, and books into volumes. And written language is structured in that iterative and progressive way as a function of the way that the process of level 2 thinking operates in a Series 4 mind, because written language is the externalization of the iterative and progressive mental process whereby concepts that are created by a mind are then able to be used in the construction of higher order concepts. And since written language is constructed as the result of an iterative process, then it should, like the relationally structured universe in which it arises, be fractal in nature. And as it turns out, that is indeed the case. Specifically, written language can be considered fractal because it exhibits self-similarity across different scales, meaning patterns and relationships observed at the level of individual words can also be seen in sentences, paragraphs, and even entire text, demonstrating a repeating structure at various levels of complexity. And the evolutionary benefit of being able to form complex mental realities or concepts is that such concepts allow for more complex and nuanced responses to external reality that are not limited by what one's mind is able to create as physical reality. However, as I have pointed out in most, if not all, of these videos, the ability to form complex mental realities or concepts comes with a significant downside, because unlike physical reality, conceptual reality, especially in a level 4 mind, is not tethered by its method of creation to the relationally structured reality that is actually there where physical reality appears to be. Instead, in a Series 4 mind, conceptual reality, owing to its connect the dots method of construction, may or may not be accurately reflective of any actually existent external situation, circumstance, or reality. Put another way, a Series 4 mind can be used to accurately connect mental dots in a way that produces a concept that reveals some underlying and otherwise hidden truth about reality, or a Series 4 mind can be used to inaccurately connect mental dots in a way that produces a concept that tells a complete and utter lie about reality, so that rather than revealing some truth about reality, that lie or false concept instead functions to conceal the truth about reality. For example, throughout these videos, I have been connecting mental dots to form concepts that reveal the underlying structural reality that lies hidden behind the physical appearance. Science, on the other hand, for quite some time now has been connecting mental dots to form mistaken materialistic concepts that falsely portray physical reality as being, in some way, shape, or form, the reality that's actually there. And while those mistaken materialistic concepts have not kept human beings from getting better at manipulating certain aspects of external reality, and so have not prevented human beings from advancing technologically, those mistaken materialistic concepts have kept hidden from our individual awarenesses the truth regarding our own reality and nature. And so they have kept us from advancing psychologically, with the overall result being one of increasing technological advancement with no real decrease and perhaps even an increase in psychological suffering. You see, an accurately constructed concept can function as a window that reveals rather than conceals something about reality, whereas an inaccurately constructed concept, regardless of whatever limited utility it might provide in responding to external reality, always functions as a wall that conceals rather than reveals something about reality. And all our inaccurately constructed concepts taken together are functioning as the walls of a cage in which our individual awarenesses have become effectively trapped. And the conceptual cage in which almost all individual human awarenesses are presently effectively trapping themselves is their mistaken concept of self. And that mistaken concept of self is constructed by connecting various mental dots to the innate idea or sense of I am, which then produces the mistaken concept I am this or I am that, where this and that can be any mental reality or concept that a human mind can come up with. And at the present time, most individual human awarenesses spend their entire organic life effectively trapped within the conceptual cage that is their mind generated idea of self or ego, because they mistakenly believe those false concepts of self to be what they really are, in the same way they mistakenly believe physical reality to be what's actually there. And they suffer tremendously as a result, because while operating from within a false concept of self, one responds to reality not according to what one really is, but according to whatever it is that one mistakenly believes and conceives themselves to be. And as often as not, or more often than not, those unconscious, conditioned, and reactive responses cause the individual and animating awareness to direct or flow its conscious intention in opposition to the conscious intention of its non localized self, because we don't get to choose our responses to physical reality. Instead, we only get to choose the concepts that are then used to dictate our responses to physical reality, because our mental or conceptual reality and our responses to reality are two different aspects of the same underlying mind event. And that same underlying mind event is the arising in the mind of some set of outwardly penetrating impacted boundaries that, on the one hand, function as the mind's response to external reality, and, on the other hand, function as a set of concave lenses that inwardly reflect a particular conceptual reality. And in that way, our conceptual realities, which are our self constructed and self absorbed interpretations of reality, function as a sort of response filter through which we view physically perceived reality. Because for most human beings, most of the time, there is no such thing as a pure physical perception. Instead, for most human beings, most of the time, there is a mind generated physical perception that is being viewed through a mind generated mental conception. And that's because what the mind does is overlap the physical and mental appearances that it is being used to create to present the animating awareness with what appears to be a single appearance that is actually a composite appearance that is composed of both a mind generated physical appearance and a mind generated conceptual appearance. It is already known with absolute certainty that the mind is capable of overlapping two sets of appearances to form what appears to be a single appearance that is actually composed of two overlapping appearances, because that's how our minds produce the stereoscopic appearance that we are aware of as three-dimensional physical reality. That is, there is not even a three-dimensional physical appearance actually there where three-dimensional physical reality appears to be. Instead, there are only two slightly offset two-dimensional physical appearances that are being created by our mind and then overlap to produce what we become aware of as a composite three-dimensional physical appearance. Likewise, VR headsets do not produce a three-dimensional image. VR headsets produce two slightly offset two-dimensional images that are overlapped by the mind to produce what then appears as a single three-dimensional image. And in the same way, and at an even more fundamental level, our minds overlap the physical and mental appearances that it is being used to create to present us, the animating and illuminating awareness, with what appears to be a single appearance that is actually a composite appearance that is composed of a mind generated physical appearance that is being viewed through the filter of a mind generated conceptual appearance. However, at the present time, most human beings are not actively aware or conscious of the conceptual component of that composite appearance, which is why their individual awarenesses are able to become effectively entrapped within and effectively enslaved by that unseen conceptual component. Instead, most human beings mistakenly believe that they are aware of physical reality as it is, never knowing that they are, at almost all times, only aware of physical reality as it appears through the filter of whatever concepts or mental interpretations of reality they have either created or absorbed. And those unseen concepts or mental interpretations of reality not only affect how we perceive physical reality, but they also determine how we respond to physically perceived reality because that's what they're supposed to do. That is, with respect to a Series 4 mind, mental or conceptual reality is, at least in part, a self constructed and self absorbed interpretation of reality that is supposed to provide the animating awareness with a response template that allows for more functional responses to physically perceived reality. But what conceptual reality is not supposed to do is function as a sort of cage in which the animating awareness becomes effectively entrapped, or as a master to which the animating awareness becomes enslaved. But that is how conceptual reality is presently functioning for most human beings, and as you may have noticed, it is not a pleasant experience. As I've explained in this series of videos, the formless awareness that we really are creates these organic technologies out of itself by forming a progressive series of relations with itself. And then it flows through and so inserts itself into these organic technologies for reasons that I have yet to fathom. All I know is that we flow through and animate these organic technologies without having the slightest clue of what we really are and of what is actually going on, because we have become completely caught up in and so effectively trapped within the physical and mental appearances that these organic technologies have evolved to produce as a result of mistakenly believing those appearances to be realities that are both actually there and what we really are. And owing to the mirror reflection type of relation that exists between the reality that is both actually there and what we really are, and the physical and mental appearances that these organic technologies allow the reality that we really are to create and become aware of, the simple and yet unavoidable mistake of mistakenly believing what are just mind generated physical and mental appearances to be realities that are both actually there and what we really are has left our individual awarenesses as they flow through and animate these organic technologies, completely unaware of the fundamental and formless reality that is both producing and aware of those appearances, and so has left us completely unaware of what we really are, thereby leaving our individual awarenesses effectively trapped in what are only mind generated realities, where we then suffer as we inevitably, inadvertently, unknowingly, and quite often end up directing our localized conscious intention in opposition to our non localized conscious intention as we automatically, reflexively, and unconsciously respond to physical reality according to how it appears when perceived through whatever set of conceptual filters our individual awareness has inadvertently and unknowingly trapped itself within. On the other hand, when we operate with some awareness of what we really are, not a conceptual awareness, but a direct awareness, we don't cause ourselves to suffer any more than we would purposefully jab ourselves in the eye with a pointed stick. Because while directly aware of what we really are, directing our localized conscious intention in opposition to our non localized conscious intention, and thereby producing a negative emotion, just does not present itself as a productive and so reasonable way to respond to reality. And so we just naturally and without any effort don't do that. Conversely, when we operate in complete unawareness of what we really are, meaning in the absence of any direct awareness of the fundamental and formless reality that is actually there where physical and mental reality appear to be, we go around responding to reality by doing the equivalent of jabbing ourselves in the eye with a pointed stick, because while completely unaware of what we really are, responding to reality in a way that causes us to direct our localized conscious intention in opposition to our non localized conscious intention, and thereby produce a negative emotion, quite often presents itself as a productive and so reasonable way to respond to reality, so that we quite often end up naturally doing something that is actually quite unnatural, inasmuch as no one really wants to suffer, since suffering is, by its nature, unwanted, inasmuch as suffering is the experiential product of self opposition, and no one really wants to be in the position of acting or moving in opposition to their self. It's just that we get caught up in mental loops where we end up inadvertently, unknowingly, and chronically flowing our localized conscious intention in opposition to the conscious intention of our non localized self, which then creates the persistent negative emotions that are the essence of psychological suffering. And we do that because we have completely lost sight of our true, timeless, and formless self, which then leaves us with no choice but to respond to reality according to what is only a mind generated, connect the dots conception of self that bears no relation whatsoever to our true self and nature. Nothing good ever comes from self opposition. The only thing that self opposition produces is suffering. Now, here you might say, then why doesn't our non localized self change its direction of conscious intention to match ours so that we don't have to suffer? And the answer is for the same reason that you don't let someone who is wearing a blindfold drive you around. Our non localized self knows where the reality that we really are wants to go and how to get there, and we don't. It's not our job to know. Our job is to align our localized flow with our larger flow so that we can function as its conscious instrument at this highly iterated level of reality as it guides us and so guides itself to where it is that the reality that we really are wants to go as it continues to form progressive relations with itself. But our larger or non localized self can't emotionally guide us to where it is that the reality that we really are wants to go when we continuously ignore the emotional guidance that is being continuously provided to us. And we continuously ignore that emotional guidance because we are continuously operating from within and so continuously responding to a reality according to what is only a mind generated conception and appearance of self that bears no relation whatsoever to the reality that we really are. As an individual awareness that is flowing through and animating a fourth level structure, you have free will, i.e., the ability to project or direct your individual flow of awareness with an attitude of either allowing or resistance toward what you are aware of as reality. But that free will does not exist in isolation, separate and apart from all the rest of the reality that you also really are. Instead, our localized free will is operating within our larger non localized free will, and that larger non localized free will is always being projected or directed with an attitude of complete allowing, acceptance, and non resistance toward reality because the non localized pole of our indivisible awareness duality, unlike us, is aware that the only reality that is actually there where any reality appears to be is itself. And so emotional reality is just a created reality that lets you know if your localized free will or conscious intention is operating in alignment with or opposition to your larger free will or conscious intention. That's all. Specifically, as an individual awareness that is flowing through and animating a fourth level structure, you have no choice but to choose in every moment, either consciously or unconsciously, to direct your localized conscious intention in a way that either allows or resists what you are aware of as reality. And the choice you make in that regard places your localized awareness in a relation of either alignment or opposition with respect to your larger non localized conscious intention. And that relation determines the positive or negative quality of the emotional reality that you are creating and experiencing in that moment. It's just that simple. Put another way, emotional reality is always self generated and is not being imposed upon you from the outside. Events and circumstances over which you have little to no control do occur and are imposed upon you from the outside. But it is how you direct your conscious intention as you respond to those events and circumstances with an attitude of either allowing or resistance, and not the events and circumstances themselves that determine what you create and experience as your emotional reality. And so your emotional reality is a reality that you potentially have the ability to completely control once you regain the ability to control the attitude with which you are directing your conscious intention as you respond to events and circumstances over which you have little to no control. But you can't take control of the attitude with which you are directing your conscious intention as long as you're responding to events and circumstances while completely unaware of the reality that you really are. Because while completely unaware of the reality that you really are, you aren't really freely choosing that attitude as you respond. Instead, while completely unaware of the reality that you really are, the attitude with which you direct your conscious intention, and so the emotional reality you create and experience, is effectively being chosen for you by whatever set of conceptual filters your individual awareness has through misidentification inadvertently and unknowingly trapped itself within. That's unconscious reactivity, an automatic and reflexive directing of our conscious intention in an attitude of either allowing or resistance that is not being consciously chosen by us, but is instead being dictated by the mind generated concept of self that we must mistakenly believe ourselves to be for as long as we have no awareness whatsoever of the reality that we really are. And while operating with no awareness whatsoever of the reality that we really are, events and circumstances sometimes appear to be to our liking, as seen through our conceptual filter. And so we automatically and reflexively direct our conscious intention with an attitude of allowing toward those events and circumstances, and thereby reactively create a positive emotion as a result. And at other times, while operating with no awareness whatsoever of the reality that we really are, events and circumstances appear to be not to our liking, as seen through our conceptual filter, and so we automatically and reflexively direct our conscious intention with an attitude of resistance toward those events and circumstances, and thereby reactively create a negative emotion as a result. But that's not freedom. That's not the free exercise of our will. That's our will operating in bondage and servitude to what is only a mind generated concept of self, in which case, then, it's not free at all. It's still what can be called will, which is the projection of awareness toward a particular reality with a particular attitude or conscious intention, but that attitude or conscious intention is not being chosen freely. Instead, it's being chosen automatically, reflexively, and reactively as a function of whatever set of mind generated conceptual appearances that we have made the mistake of misidentifying with and so mistakenly believing ourselves to be. That's why our emotions seem to be out of our control and instead seem to be determined by external events and circumstances, not because they really or ultimately are, but only because while our individual awareness is operating from within a conceptualization of self, the attitude or conscious intention with which we direct our will toward any event or circumstance is not being chosen freely by us, but is instead being automatically chosen as a programmed or conditioned response that is being determined by and really predetermined by whatever mind generated concept of self we have inadvertently trapped our individual awareness within. And again, that's why propaganda and misinformation work, because propaganda and misinformation are a sort of programming that an individual allows to be inserted into their conception of reality or self so that that individual's subsequent responses to certain events and circumstances become automatic, reflexive, and reactive in a way that benefits the propagandist and not the individual who is responding. That's how you get people to consistently vote against their own interest, because they're not really making a conscious choice when they vote, but are instead just responding according to how they have been programmed or conditioned to respond. That's why they call it identity politics. Find out what people identify with and then use that to control them by convincing them through propaganda and misinformation that the other political party is going to take it away, so that that other political party is then seen and responded to as an enemy that one would never, under any circumstances, vote for. But that's just an extreme example of what we all do, because we all act in ways that are not in our best interest as a function of how we have been programmed or conditioned to respond by our surroundings, i.e., by our parents, society, culture, social media, or whatever. For example, getting angry or extremely frustrated by some unwanted event or circumstance is usually not in our best interest, yet we all do it to some degree, because that's how we have been programmed or conditioned to respond to unwanted events and circumstances. It is almost never in our best interest to generate negative emotions as a response to events and circumstances, especially over the long haul. Momentary negativity may be unavoidable and even functional in some extreme situations, but if it persists, it invariably becomes dysfunctional. Because if we are responding to any event or circumstance in a way that is generating a negative emotion, that can only mean one thing: we are responding to that event or circumstance with a conscious intention that is not aligned with the conscious intention of our non localized awareness. And it is always in our best interest to respond to a situation in a way that aligns with the conscious intention of our non localized awareness, because, as stated previously, our non localized awareness knows where the reality that we really are wants to go and the best way to get there from wherever it is that we are in the moment, and we don't. As mentioned in a previous video, internal alignment with the present moment, and so with a conscious intention of the non-localized pole of your indivisible awareness duality, does not mean that you let someone hit you on the head with a hammer or keep abusing you in some way. Internal alignment, i.e., aligning your localized conscious intention with your non-localized conscious intention, just means not internally opposing the reality of the situation as it is in that moment. And internally opposing the reality of the situation as it is in that moment is what we almost always do whenever some unwanted circumstance arises, as long as we are operating solely from within a mind generated concept of self. Because internally opposing the reality of the situation, and so internal opposition, is the ego's automatic response to any unwanted situation, whereas internal alignment is the ego's automatic response to any wanted situation. And what internally opposing the in the moment reality of the situation means is that one's conscious intention is being directed in opposition to what one is aware of as reality. And while that sort of internal response can sometimes lead to external opposition or some sort of violence, what it always leads to, at least in the human or series 4 mind, is the production of thoughts that in some way oppose the reality of the situation. And what I mean by thoughts that in some way oppose the reality of the situation are thoughts that involve believing or thinking the situation should be other than it is. And here we need to distinguish between believing or thinking the situation should be other than it is and wanting the unwanted situation to be other than it is. It is natural and unavoidable to want the situation to be other than it is when some unwanted situation arises. That is not in question, and there's no way around that. However, believing or thinking the situation should be other than it is something else entirely. Responding to a situation by believing or thinking the situation should be other than it is a completely futile and counterproductive way to use the mind to respond to any situation, because in that moment, the situation is as it is, and so it cannot possibly, in that moment, be any other way. And so using the mind in that way is the mental equivalent of responding to a situation by banging one's head against a wall. And we all recognize that sort of response as being a sign of insanity when it occurs externally. But we do not recognize that same behavior when it occurs as a mental response to reality as being insane, because we all do it. So it seems normal, even though it is still quite insane and quite dysfunctional. Now, what do I mean by responding to a situation by believing or thinking the situation should be other than it is? It means responding to a situation by using the mind to generate thoughts that oppose the situation, such as this should not be happening, or he or she should not be doing that, or why does this always happen to me, and so on and so forth. One problem with these types of mental responses is that they generate a lot of mind activity in response to the unwanted situation without actually doing anything about the unwanted situation itself. And the other problem with these types of mental responses is that they generate a lot of negative emotions in response to the unwanted situation because the conscious intention behind such thoughts is always self oppositional rather than self aligned. And the conscious intention behind such thoughts is always self oppositional rather than self aligned because, whatever the situation is, your non localized awareness is the reality that is actually there where any physical reality appears to be. Therefore, directing your conscious intention in opposition to what you are aware of as reality is actually, beyond the physical surface appearance, self opposition. Again, what you experience as reality, physical, mental, and emotional, is not the result of relations that take place between realities that are only appearances. And what that means is that what you experience as physical, mental, and emotional reality is not the result of relations that are taking place between physical, mental, and emotional realities, because those are all just created appearances that can't really do anything other than exist as realities that the reality that is actually there can become aware of. Instead, as I'm trying to make clear in these videos, what you experience as reality, i.e., the physical, mental, and emotional realities that arise in your awareness, are the result of relations that take place between different aspects of the formless, indivisible, and yet individualized and relationally structured reality that is actually there where those experiential appearances only appear to be. And as a result, internal opposition to experiential unwantedness is both futile and counterproductive. Futile because the situation in that moment is as it is, and so cannot possibly, in that moment, be other than it is, and counterproductive for two reasons. One, it wastes energy generating useless thoughts regarding the situation rather than dealing with the situation directly. And two, it generates negative emotions. And that is why internal opposition to experiential unwantedness leaves our individual awareness effectively trapped in an experiential cage where we are then tortured by our own thoughts and, more specifically, are tortured by the negative emotions that are being invariably and persistently generated along with those thoughts. And at the present time, most human beings respond to experiential unwantedness by automatically and reflexively directing their conscious intention in opposition to that unwantedness because most human beings at the present time are trapped fully and completely within their egos or mind generated concept of self. And as a result, their internal or conscious intention response to reality has become inadvertently automated, and so takes place at an unconscious level, and so at a level over which they no longer have direct conscious control. Automation can be good, but automation can also be problematic when you inadvertently automate a choice that you should be making consciously. For example, you want to go somewhere, and so your map app automatically generates different route options that you can then choose from. That is good automation. But now consider that for some reason you inadvertently automate the choice of routes as well, so that you are no longer consciously choosing the route you take, but are instead having that route chosen for you by some program or algorithm. That is problematic automation, because that sort of automation can take you through places you really don't want to be while on your way to where it is you are going. And it is that sort of problematic automation that most human beings are presently caught up in, not with regard to their map apps, but with regard to how they are choosing to direct their conscious intention toward what they are aware of as reality. And the app that is making that choice for them, without any regard for how that choice is making them feel in the moment, i.e., without any regard for the emotional reality that that choice is generating, is their mind generated concept of self or ego. The ego can serve some useful functions, but automatically choosing our direction of conscious intention is not one of them. We are supposed to be choosing our direction of conscious intention, i.e., our internal attitude toward what we are aware of as reality, consciously, based on the in the moment emotional feedback we receive as a result of whatever choice we are making. But the algorithm the ego uses to make that choice of internal attitude does not factor in that in the moment emotional feedback, and so just basically ignores it, which is why emotional reality seems like something that just happens to us rather than a reality that we are ourselves creating. The ego does factor in emotional reality, but it only factors in emotional reality as it wants it to exist in some conceptual future or as it already existed in some conceptual past. And that's because the ego is itself a conceptual reality that requires the conceptual environment of a conceptual past or future to exist within. And past and future are always conceptual in nature because past and future only exist as mind generated mental appearances and nowhere else. On the other hand, the ultimately formless reality that is both actually there and what you really are only ever is now, because what we refer to as the now is that timeless and uncreated reality. As stated in previous videos, there is no such thing as a reality that exists absent some awareness of that reality. And the proof of that is the inability to name a reality of which you are not aware. And any reality that you are aware of, you are only ever aware of now, because awareness and the now are two words that actually indicate or point toward the same underlying and fundamental reality that both creates and is conscious or aware of all experiential realities. And what I am doing is explaining step by step in extreme and excruciating detail exactly how that formless and fundamental reality, through relation to itself, creates what you, as that reality, become aware of as physical, mental, and emotional reality. So you can stop misidentifying with those created realities so that you can instead become aware of and identify with the reality that you really are. Because what really makes human existence suck is not unwanted situations and circumstances. Instead, what really makes human existence suck is the way we automatically and unconsciously respond to unwanted situations and circumstances while misidentified with and so effectively trapped within our mind generated concept of self. And so let's continue. While operating with no awareness whatsoever of the reality that we really are, we have no choice but to misidentify with and use as our conceptual response filter some concept of self. And when that is the case, the attitude with which we exercise our free will or direct our conscious intention toward events and circumstances is not being consciously chosen by us, but is instead an unconscious response that is being dictated by whatever concept of self we are unknowingly and effectively trapped within. And that's why most people spend most of their lives trying to control their emotional reality by controlling external events and circumstances, or by changing their concept of self, or both. And those methods can work to some degree to reduce one's level of suffering, but they still leave one's individual awareness effectively trapped in a mind generated concept of self where one still has no choice but to unconsciously exercise their free will or conscious intention in bondage and servitude to their mind generated concept of self. But there is an easier, more direct, and more reliable way to control your emotional reality so that you can suffer less. And that's why I'm not here to help you redecorate the walls of your mind generated prison so that it is a somewhat more pleasant cage to be trapped within. Instead, I'm here to help you see through and tear down the walls of that prison so that you can live your organic life in a state of true freedom where you have an actual choice with regard to how you exercise your free will or direct your conscious intention, instead of living in a state of false freedom where there is only the illusion of choice in that regard. And if you can do that, it becomes possible to generate a positive rather than a negative emotion, regardless of the situation. That is the peace that passeth all understanding. Because what we experience as our in the moment emotional reality is not a function of what is happening externally, but is 100% a function of the relation of conscious intention that exists between our localized individuality and our non localized individuality in that moment, with aligned relations producing positive emotions and oppositional relations producing negative emotions. That's all. True freedom is the freedom to consciously choose how you exercise your free will or conscious intention regardless of circumstances. Whereas false freedom is being bound by your concept of self to unconsciously choose how you exercise your free will or conscious intention as an automatic, reflexive, and so reactive response to circumstances. Choosing whether to yell, slam down your fist, or stomp away may seem like choices, But if those are the only choices you seem to have in a particular situation, that's because you have most likely already unconsciously made the primary and truly important choice as a function of how your concept of self is dictating that you internally respond to that situation. And that primary and truly important choice is the choice to direct your conscious intention toward events and circumstances in an attitude of either allowing or resistance. And you are making that choice in every moment, whether you know it or not. And most do not, because for most people, that choice is being made automatically, reflexively, and unconsciously as a function of whatever mind generated concept of self they are, through misidentification, effectively trapped within. And once you have unconsciously chosen to direct your conscious intention towards some event or circumstances in an internal attitude of resistance, all you are then left to consciously decide is how you will direct and use the negative emotional energy that you are unconsciously creating as a result of that unconscious choice. And so it may seem like you are getting to consciously and so freely choose how you are responding to reality, but that's just an illusion of freedom because the truly important choice was already made unconsciously and so unfreely. And that then puts you in the position of having to consciously choose and being effectively forced to choose between what is a very limited array of unhelpful and somewhat dysfunctional responses that all derive from your unconscious response of internal resistance toward the event or circumstance. It's like unconsciously picking up a knife and then having to consciously choose whether to stab your left or right arm. That's not a real choice, and that's not real freedom. That's the illusion of choice and the illusion of freedom. And that's why we suffer so much, because we don't have conscious control over whether or not we pick up the knife of negative emotion when we encounter some unwanted event or circumstance. Instead, when some unwanted event or circumstance arises, we automatically, unconsciously, and reactively go for the knife. And only then do we start consciously choosing how to wield that knife. But no matter how we choose to wield it, we always end up stabbing ourselves because our true self is the only real reality there actually is, as all other realities are just unreal appearances. The only choice that really matters is the choice we make with regard to the attitude of either acceptance or resistance with which we are directing our awareness toward what we are aware of as reality. Because, as already stated, what we experience as our emotional reality is 100% a function of that choice. Mental and physical information are supposed to be supplemental to the primary in the moment emotional information that lets us know how we are in that moment, directing our conscious intention, because that's how these organic technologies evolved and so were designed to operate. But that's not how the ego operates, i.e., our in the moment emotional reality does not factor into its response algorithm, at least not in the primary way that it is supposed to, and usually not at all. And as a result, the ego makes our primary free will or conscious intention choice for us without any regard for how that choice makes us feel in the moment. And it is also the case that our subsequent choices and actions all follow and flow naturally from that primary free will or conscious intention choice. That is, if we choose an internal attitude of allowing or acceptance toward what we are aware of as reality, then we are presented with one set of external responses to choose from. But if we instead choose an internal attitude of opposition or resistance, we are then presented with a different set of external responses to choose from. And it is simply the case that the most functional and truly beneficial external responses are those that present themselves when the internal response is one of acceptance rather than resistance. Therefore, when the internal response is one of resistance rather than acceptance, the most functional and truly beneficial external responses are nowhere to be found, because one is then being presented with an entirely different set of external responses to choose from, all of which are either less functional or, in many cases, completely dysfunctional and not truly or ultimately beneficial. And when your individual awareness is effectively trapped in a mind generated concept of self, which most people's awarenesses presently are, it is simply the case that you do not have conscious control with regard to the attitude with which you are directing your awareness toward what you are aware of as reality, because that choice is effectively being made for you automatically by your concept of self, because that's what concepts are supposed to do, i.e., allow for the automation of responses to reality so that we don't have to make a conscious choice with regard to every situation and circumstance that our bodies encounter. For example, If you enter a hot environment, your body automatically dilates blood vessels in your skin so that more heat radiates away from your body so your body can maintain its optimal operating temperature. That is, you don't have to choose whether or not to dilate the blood vessels in your skin because that choice has become automated by a concept that exists within your mind at what is now a subconscious level, but which at one time in our organic evolution no doubt existed at a conscious level. And the same is true for every automated response of which our bodies are capable. The problem is how we exercise our free will, i.e., the attitude with which we direct our conscious intention toward what we are aware of as reality, is not supposed to be conceptually automated, which is to say, it is not supposed to be automatic, reflexive, and unconscious, but is supposed to be a choice that we make consciously and so consciously control. That is the one choice that individual awarenesses are not supposed to see to conceptual automation. Because if we are not free to make that choice consciously, then we have no choice but to live as the emotional victims of circumstance, feeling good when good stuff happens and feeling bad when bad stuff happens, never knowing that we have the ability to choose an internal attitude that allows us to feel good regardless of what is happening. And again, that is the peace that passeth all understanding, i.e., a feeling of tranquility that can exist even in difficult circumstances. However, I would say that such peace is very understandable, because to understand why such a thing is possible, all one has to do is understand two things. One, the very simple self aligned or self oppositional relation of individualized awareness to itself that produces what we are aware of as our emotional reality. And two, the fact that we have the innate ability to consciously choose which of those relations we become involved in with the other pole of our individuality. The thing that places such peace beyond our understanding is the fact that so few people ever exercise their innate ability to make that choice consciously because they have unknowingly and inadvertently ceded that choice to conceptual automation as a result of misidentifying with what is only a mind generated concept of self. It is simply the case that, at the present time, the individual awarenesses that are flowing through and animating the fourth level structures that we perceive and conceive as bacteria have more control over their emotional reality than do most human beings. And that's because the individual awarenesses that are flowing through and animating the fourth level structures that we perceive and conceive as bacteria have not become effectively trapped within a concept of self, because their primitive minds are not capable of producing concepts. But our minds are capable of producing abstract concepts, and so our minds are capable of producing a concept of self. And that's where the problem of inadvertent conceptual automation comes in. And that brings us to the end of part 3 of video 5. And in the next or fourth part of this 4-part video, I will explain why our minds produce a concept of self and how our misidentification with that concept of self inadvertently automates a choice that is not supposed to be automated, so that we then go through life responding to reality in a reactive and unconscious way that results in our individual awareness effectively trapping itself in a reality cage that is composed of mind generated physical and mental appearances that our individual awareness, in concert with its mind, is itself creating. So I'll see you over there.